Hey, I'm Andrew Gibbons, and here to my left, I'm not sure if that's yours, Rebecca, or anyone else's, is Rebecca Norton. And today we're going to discuss briefly, too briefly as ever, limiting assumptions, their significance, the way they can impact on us as individuals, and specifically also within coaching practice. I'm not going to say all the things that we agreed Rebecca would to kick us off with. So Rebecca, place it in context for us and where we're going to go with it.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I think we've been discussing thinking environment by Nancy Klein for quite a while now. And one of the things that she talks about is limiting assumptions and sort of recognizing that, then challenging them as well. And it's certainly something that I think that's a really valuable thing that we can all take. And I recognize that, learning to recognize it in myself, but also using it with my clients and recognizing in my clients when they're saying something that's completely like, I'm not entirely sure that that's true, sort of thing. So these limiting assumptions can be quite damaging because a lot of the time they're very subtle as well. And I think that's the problem with these limiting assumptions. I think, like you said, it's really good to recognize them. So recognizing when we're sort of expressing limiting assumptions, but also how do we overcome them as well. So I think, if we've got time, I'd like us to have a think about how do we overcome these limiting assumptions as well.
And I'm still an optimist. There could be some limiting assumptions which are so limiting that they are real and they may be insurmountable. So then the discussion comes about what do we do to mitigate them? What can we do to cause the least impact from them? So we shouldn't, in my view, assume that all limiting assumptions are possible to be overcome.
No, definitely not. And I wouldn't necessarily say that all limiting assumptions are a negative thing either, that we can take positives from them. I think that's the other point to bear in mind as well.
I think that's a really good point, because I have reflected on this in my usual rather obsessive way when I picked it out of Time for Think, which I'm reading through carefully now. And we tend to think of limiting assumption. The limiting word is a negative word, isn't it? It's an obstructive word. It's a diminishing word. Yeah. I wonder if also there's the obvious, not the obvious, but the opposite to that, which is like, what would it be? If not limiting assumptions, they're empowering assumptions. Sometimes perhaps we don't make the most of our positive assumptions, the things that are good about us, the things that actually invigorate and empower and energize us. So yes, we're talking about limited assumptions because that's what Nancy Klein says, but I think there's also the opposite to them, the things that we might make more of that are empowering assumptions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. And what's linking both of those is the power of language. I think that's what it comes down to, is that the beliefs are determined by the words we use, and they then determine our actions and stuff. So that's a really good point. So we can use them to our advantage, and like you say, yes, make them more empowering assumptions about things as well. That's a really good point.
Well, great. I like making good points, and I feel all the better when you see them and not just me. So limiting assumptions, let's go there. Let's first of all unpack it. What are they?
Oh, it's a deep-seated belief about something is what I tend to find, and I often recognize it in other people. Sometimes it's harder to recognize it in ourselves. It's much easier to see it in other people. Yeah. So I had a coaching client the other week, and she just reeled off quite a few of them in one go. And it's like, hang on a minute, should we backtrack a little bit on that?
83 is enough at a time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and it was, one of the things was that she was too old to change careers, or it was too old to do something else. She was 33. Right. And I'm thinking, wow, hang on a minute, that's not old. So she'd already made an assumption. I know you're off the scale, I'm afraid.
Oh, mate.
So she'd already made an assumption that she was too old to change something, that she felt that she'd already sort of missed out on it. But it's interesting that I've dealt with a few younger people, only in the 30s, who feel that they've already sort of missed out on things. They're now older, and it's like, that's quite a big limiting assumption. So that was one thing. And she,
well, can I just stop you there, because by interrupting, doing so very deliberately, because I want to go further with this. Where did it come from? Did it come from her? Was it conversations with others? Was it observations of others? Where do you think that came from? We're not going to identify her. We're not going to say who she is. But I mean, I think this is typical of a lot of people. And I'm very interested and a bit distressed that it's of a 33-year-old. I'm 61. I've got a right to feel I've got limited assumptions. I've had 40 years reflecting on them. So where do you think that's come from?
I think that is a really good point, and I think that's where we as coaches can help people to try and identify, is this your belief?
I'm going to drop some light. Keep talking and drop some light from the blind. Yeah.
Is this your belief, or has this come from somewhere else? I think sometimes it comes from peer group. It comes from sort of maybe a societal expectation. I think, that we have this sort of expectation that by whatever age we should have got a job, settled down, got a house, X, Y, and Z. So I think sometimes we pick things up subconsciously from what's going on around us and the people around us. But that is a really good question. And I think that's one thing that can help people, is just ask yourself, hang on a minute, is this my belief, or have I picked this up from somewhere else?
Whoa. And that might not be a conversation they've had with themselves. One of the things that I've found in reflecting on my own vast number of limiting assumptions is that that's just what I think. If I was in conversation with someone, if I was doing that interactive thing, I was doing that with a coach, then perhaps the coach would find even more, or would get me to be a bit more realistic. When you only have conversations with yourself, that's all you've got.
It is, and I think this is where it's more difficult with yourself. It's only when you're either sometimes speaking things out loud, you realise, actually, you know what, that sounds really ridiculous. Now I've said that out loud. So that's one good thing. But also just having somebody else to bounce ideas off. And seeing things from other people's perspective as well can be helpful. So I think that's why we often recognise it easier in other people than we do in ourselves, because if we sort of seeing it, it's almost like a mirror, and it's like, hang on a minute, that's a really stupid thing to say. Why would somebody think that they're too old at 33? When it's yourself, it's much more difficult, because you just coming from what you know, aren't you?
So is this when you tell me this was an Olympic gymnast or something?
No, not at all. She'd already felt like she'd missed some opportunities and things, and it's like, well, you've still got plenty of time to change. I think, and I don't think she'd even, I can't remember what else she said now. There was a couple in it, and it's like, oh, hang on a minute, let's back. There were that many that it's like, hang on, we need to stop here and let's have a look at these one at a time. And I think this is where, so one of the things that I try and help people to do with limited assumptions is learn how to recognize them. But if you're finding yourself saying something like, well, I can't do that, or people like me don't do X, Y, and Z, that's when you sort of think, hang on a minute, is that from me, or am I picking that up from somewhere else? And that's how I get people to help them recognize whether that's a limiting assumption or not.
See, from a coaching perspective, I've always believed in the relational value. I'm not one of these people that thinks you can instantly sit in front of someone and transform their lives. I think that takes time, personally. Just my opinion. Other people feel differently. I think it takes time to understand people's circumstances, personality, context. And that means that to be the most help in this way, I think you need to know that stuff. You need to all know the background. Otherwise, the help you can be is very superficial.
Yeah, that's true. It is learning. It's sort of, I suppose there's two levels to this, isn't there? This was the first conversation that I'd had with that lady, but that was screaming at me. It's like, whoa, that is a real bigger limiting assumption.
Yeah, sure.
Where some things, like you say, are more subtle. So somebody says, well, I can't do that because X, Y, Z. We might not challenge them on that, because we might think, well, actually, no, that's true, they can't. But then is that us thinking about putting our own limitations on them and just going along with it, where actually as coaches, I think that's really important that we're mindful of that. Are we bringing our own experiences and our own beliefs into that coaching relationship? Or can we be, very open-minded and non-judgmental about things?
And to me, that fits very neatly with the rest of the Nancy Klein stuff. I'm talking like a disciple these days, which is all about giving people time, not jumping in with your own unhelpful anecdotes, experience, and so on, just allowing people to go where they need. So this is powerful to me, because helping people overcome what is surmountable is a great way to be helpful. So I think limiting assumptions are hugely powerful and give insights into people's deeply held, but not very often widely reflected upon, and maybe uncomfortable issues they have never worked through on their own.
That's a really good point, isn't it? I think that's where as coaches we can really use our skills, and just listening to them. and sometimes it's maybe listening to it and making a mental note of it or a written note that actually I'm going to come back to this, but you don't want to interrupt them while they're in full flow, because I think that again is really important because we distract their thinking. But it is, I think we have to be careful as well as coaches to just not let people get away with these limiting assumptions.
Yeah.
I do feel that we have a duty to challenge them to some extent, or at least mention them and bring them to their awareness, because otherwise we'll be doing them a disservice.
I believe so. And, you know, I've been in the business of helping people to learn for very close to 40 years. My 40th year starts in a couple of weeks. And, you know, I'm prepared to say, I don't think I've thought with sufficient clarity about these sorts of things often enough. I think I've allowed myself to get into that groove of ask the clever questions, look reflective, summarize, do all the things that blah, blah, blah. But that's very superficial. Here we're talking about a deeper, more meaningful way to help people, which is about saying, no, let's only talk about you specifically, your circumstances, things that are in your way. Tell me what they are, and then we can work together on identifying which of those we can work upon in priority order and which we can park, say, whoa, those are long term or those are downright impossible. I think it's a very powerful methodology.
It is, and again, you know, that's why working with a coach can be so useful, because you've got somebody who has got that experience, that training, and those capabilities of drawing things out and helping people see things from a different angle, you know. And I think a lot of it is about mindset and helping. You're right. I don't think we can make a transformation in maybe just one session, but we can start that transformation.
Yeah.
Sometimes all it needs is one little thing to hit. You know, I've got another client who said that coaching has been really helpful to her because it started to make her more self-aware. She's becoming more aware of the choices she's making, of the thoughts she's having. That's where coaching can be so powerful, and that, I think, is one of the keys to limiting assumptions. You've got to be aware of them first before you can challenge them. So just becoming aware of them is the first step for me.
And as ever, these conversations have taken me places I didn't expect to be taken to in my head. Dunning-Kruger effect. I won't go into it in great depth now, but Dunning-Kruger effect in a couple of sentences is that younger people very often have got very high expectations themselves and inflate expectations and performance perceptions. Older people, whatever that means, people like me, look back on a life and say, well, it could have been so much better. So younger people tend to build themselves up. And that perhaps, by the time they reach 33, is about saying, whoa, hold on a minute, I'm a failure already. No. Whereas people like me have got a right to feel we're a failure. No, not really going there. So I think there's a bit of Dunning-Kruger effect here. We overinflate and overexpect early on in careers, and we very often diminish and reflect negatively in retrospect.
Yeah, very, very much. Then I think that's an interesting one. Then, so for me, that probably means that we should be a little bit more present and aware in the moment, because it's only then that we can change it. You know, awareness is the beginning of transformation, isn't it? You know, and I think this is where we can raise people's awareness. We can help them see things from a different perspective and just challenge them gently. You know, I'm not saying that we come wading in.
Yeah. You sort out this limiting assumption.
Because some of these limiting assumptions, like you said, it can be quite deeply held and long held. So we come in and suddenly, like, you know, hold a mirror up or challenge them can actually be quite disruptive. So, like I said, sometimes it can be very uncomfortable to recognize that. So we have to be very sensitive about how we challenge them. But ultimately, I do feel it is appropriate to challenge them.
Okay, last thing for me at this time, because we're trying to keep this tight. Do you think limiting assumptions tend to be generated internally or are a consequence of an external environment? What people say, what other people are doing, how we judge ourselves against us? Is it from within, or is it an effect of the external environment?
Oh, good question. Very deep question. I would say probably it's a mixture of both. I think.
Cop out.
Well, I know it is. I think our environment does play a very big part in that. So I think that comes first. So if you are brought up in an environment where everything is very negative and the world is seen as a dangerous place, then that is going to have a serious impact on how.
Again, I'm interrupting, but banking is sometimes in the news, not just banking, but women's work, men's work, women getting paid less for work. It's very hard not to have a limiting assumption when you see people genuinely promoted when you ought to have been genuinely earning more than you are for the same job. How can that not cause a limiting assumption?
Yeah, so I think it starts externally, but then I think we take it on internally, and I think that's where we have to sort of relearn some things and actually start challenging them.
I like that, because I guess we all have, to a significant degree, some control, some management over how we manage the impact of the external environment we're in, whatever that is. So not everyone is programmed to respond the same way to the same apparent variables. So it's empowering, I think, to get people to say, you can choose what impact this has on you. Oh, sounds a bit.
I think that's right. But I think we have to learn the skills to do that. And this is almost like another podcast altogether, isn't it, really?
What are the skills to help someone through limited assumptions? Yeah. Cool.
I think that's a cliffhanger that we need to stop on, actually, and look at this.
I think for that reason we shall stop, but return as ever to something with much more in than we've covered in this short time. Thank you.